Coming up.
We need to see stiffer penalties. We absolutely need to have a deterrence for these crimes. What impacts would you think tougher penalties would have on combating auto theft?
Since most Canadians probably watch more Law and Order for these cases, for the people that you are catching, when it does go to the courts, what sort of sentences are you seeing being handed out?
Well, I think we referred to some stats, 68% under 6 months sentencing and less than 1% under 2 years. And out of 124 arrests, 55 of those subjects were out on bail when arrested.
I think in the grand scheme of this country, that's a pretty small sample size, no?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Ontario Provincial Police, Scott Wade, Detective Inspector. Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Matt Peggs, Assistant Commissioner and Commanding Officer of Federal Policing, Central Region, Division O. Martin Roach, Assistant Commissioner and Commanding Officer of Federal Policing, Eastern Region, C Division. Canada Border Service Agency, Aaron McCrory, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement.
Recently, your commissioner, sir, was here, and I have a quote here from him. He stated that auto theft is highly profitable, with little risk. And in Ontario, you see 68% of those convicted serving a sentence of 6 months or less. He also stated, and I will quote him here, "We need to see stiffer penalties. We absolutely need to have a deterrence for these crimes." What impacts would you think tougher penalties would have on combating auto theft?
Well, stiffer penalties have several effects. They provide a deterrence to the people who are committing the crimes. They also remove them from the public where they can commit more crimes. So they're out of the public and not committing crimes. Not only is there 68% of people with less than 6 months in sentencing, there's less than 1% who ever get a sentence over 2 years, even when it involves organized crime auto theft.
York Regional Police were here, and they recommended to our committee that we should consider legislative tools to combat auto theft, including the review of existing legislation and the creation of new laws related to auto thefts and organized crime activities similar to the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act. This could include offenses related to possession, trafficking, and exportation of stolen vehicles with stiffer penalties related to these crimes. Could you expand on that twofold? One is maybe just to explain to the committee what the difference is and how that could help, and then if you feel that put in place, it could help in deterring auto theft for both the RCMP and the OPP, please.
So I can speak to that specifically. The CDSA, or the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, has specific offenses related to possession for the purpose of trafficking, exporting, importing. So those are specific offenses related to drugs. With the specialized nature of auto theft and the proliferation of organized crime involved in auto theft, we need to recognize that, and that these organized crime groups are using these vehicles for profit and exporting. And if we can prove the possession for the purpose of trafficking, it should be recognized as such and as a more serious offense.
Mr. Chair, so most of this dynamic on legislation falls under our police of jurisdiction, but for us, the RCMP, I think some of the statements that we made were more to put the emphasis on the coordination aspect, and that's like we alluded to in the opening remarks of my colleague. It was the coordination that we need to do at the international level, and that's what we've been doing, working on in terms of building that capacity and expanding, putting our liaison officers at work and with the analysts and deploying and maximizing our efforts on that.
The age of some of the people who are committing some of these crimes. I was just listening the other day. There was an unbelievable event that happened in the GTA area where as young as 11-year-old was caught. There was a group of four. I think they were 11, 13, 2 15 or 16-year-olds in that area, but the one was definitely 11, were charged, or caught, pardon me, because 11-year-old can't be charged, taking a vehicle. We have heard in here in other meetings that it really is attracting a younger group to go out and go after these vehicles. Maybe just touch on how organized crime is recruiting some of these kids, young kids, and how obviously it's affecting them too, because we're seeing this as a crime that's affecting a lot of people. We're bringing kids into this now, and it's just horrific when I heard that story. Could you please expand on that a little bit about the organized crime and how and where they're getting these kids from? And are you agreeing that the ages are getting unbelievably young that are committing some of these crimes?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. It's a very good one and important. The age of the offenders involved in vehicle theft, including carjacking and home invasions, is alarming. What we're seeing is an average age of 15 to 22-year-olds engaging in these crimes, as well as you mentioned, even younger children. I think there needs to be a recognition that organized crime is employing, recruiting youth to commit their crimes, and I think there needs to be a discussion in regards to sentencing and investigations on exploiting vulnerable youth.
Anything to add to that from the RCMP at all? No. Okay, just a quick question for Mr. McCrory. Mr. McCrory, we've heard many times about the inspections of containers. We've heard, and I can't remember the number, it was a very, very low number. At one point, the rail was in here telling us that only 1/1,000,000th of all rail was inspected. What is being inspected of sea containers right now, percentage-wise, that are leaving this country?
So I'd prefer not to talk about the percentage because that gives our adversaries, if you will, a little bit of an advantage. What I can say, if you look at international reporting, that around the world, internationally, about 2% of containers are inspected, physically inspected in any given.
Quickly, because I'm almost out of time, so I'm sorry. Because I had heard in the U.S. that 50% are inspected, so they're not afraid to put their number out. They've made it vocal that they inspect 50%. Why are we afraid to put ours out? And how does that affect who's stealing a car?
What we do is what we're focused on is using intelligence and information referrals from the RCMP, for example, but also our own intelligence to target containers and separate the needles from the haystack, if you will. So and I think we're having success. If you look at the results of our targeting in the Port of Montreal, for example, we've now seized in Montreal 561 vehicles in the Port of Montreal. We've started to do the same work in the Port of Vancouver, where we're seeing cars that are being stolen in Toronto and being shipped west through the Port of Vancouver. It's about 90 to 100% of the targeting is based on our intelligence. We've recovered 27 vehicles. So we just will never have the logistical capability to screen every container going through. It would shut down our supply chains, given the volume of containers. But by being smart,
I think you'd admit we could screen a lot more.
I think we are screening a lot more when it comes to stolen vehicles, certainly more than in the past, and we're seeing the results.
Thank you both.
Existing laws, continuing criminal enterprise laws, are those being used to target organized crime with respect to auto theft, or are they insufficient and need to be updated, or I guess where does the OPP stand on this?
So again, a good point in regards to criminal organization legislation, and in the Organized Crime Enforcement Bureau of the OPP, it's our focus with every investigation. If we can apply that law, if we can apply that legislation, that we will.
And since most Canadians probably watch more Law and Order, or as much Law and Order as I do, this would be similar to RICO-style laws that exist in the United States that are on the books in Canada. Is that fair to say?
I would say that would be a simplified version of explaining what they are, but they are very different, and there's probably benefits in exploring both of them.
Many in this room would probably agree with you that I oversimplify things often, but is there items in the United States, RICO legislation, that you would see beneficial enacted in Canada, and I guess would also be constitutional, since they are those provisions are different?
I think it's a good place to start the discussion, and it's a good place to explore. I don't have the specifics of RICO legislation in the States, more the Canadian legislation, but I think it's good to explore that and what other jurisdictions are doing and how we can improve and constantly examine the tools that we have and how to utilize them best.
And I'll ask you this, and I can perhaps ask the RCMP as well, because we talk about sentences not being high enough, and we know this is outside the control of the police. This is what judges decide. This is independent. But if the maximum penalties are high, and much higher than what the average sentence is, or even cases that are very serious, what's the barrier between arrest, Crown, and actually getting a sentence? Because I know some are talking, we need stricter sentences, but if we're not using the existing maximum penalties as they are, what's happening in the criminal justice system that the existing penalties aren't being used?
Honestly, don't know how to answer that question. Because I don't think we put criminal cases forward with the idea of getting a particular sentence. I think we gather the evidence that we can and present it to the court. So, to be honest with you, I know I raised my hand to answer this question, but I don't think I don't have one other than to say that we bring the evidence forth and then the court makes those decisions.
And I appreciate that, but at the same time, I think police are telling Crown attorneys and your partners in on that side of things that this is serious, and I think Crowns understand that this is serious, involves organized crime, and there's gangs involved in the violence, and judges live in our communities, they see it with their own eyes, and so I guess I'm at a loss as to, there's been some talk of new legislation or increasing penalties, but there's already penalties on the books to deal with the serious nature of this, and I'm just understanding what the roadblock is, because if we increase the maximum penalty another 2 years or 5 years, and we're still getting sentences in the range they are now, we haven't really done anything. We've just checked a box, and that hasn't done anything.
You know, I think it was made mention that often when people are arrested with a stolen vehicle, in many cases they can be found with illegal firearms, in some cases drugs, which I would think are aggravating factors in the arrest and eventual charges, but also many have previous criminal records as well. So like when you're handing the case over to Crown prosecutors, like are you seeing that follow through, that this person obviously is not learning their lesson from the first time around and they do warrant a harsher sentence as is provided for in the criminal code?
Well, to answer that question, as an example with the Provincial Carjacking Task Force, what we're seeing is a large percentage of the offenders arrested are out on bail at the time for either other offenses or similar offenses, and then the majority of the offenders are being released on bail, when they're brought before the courts.
You said in response to the previous questions that a lot of the offenders that you're catching are out on bail. Is that the case? And you said a significant amount or a majority of the offenders are out on bail that you're catching with auto theft?
That is correct. And I was specifically referring to the Carjacking Task Force, and it was around 40% of the offenders we are arresting were out on bail at the time.
Is that a number that you think has increased over the past few years, or is that kind of an average number that you would expect as that's a normal number?
Don't have the data to back it up, but I do believe it's increasing.
It's an increasing number. We do know that with recent bail changes in 2019, Bill C-75 that the Liberals brought in, that a number of bail provisions were changed, which puts the onus on judges and police officers to release suspects. Have you seen an impact from that change in 2019, from an increase in people being let out on bail?
Again, I wish I had the data and the specific information to be able to answer that question, confidently, but I do believe that we've seen an increase.
And what are some of the sentences that you're seeing for these cases for the people that you are catching when it does go to the courts? What sort of sentences are you seeing being handed out?
Well, I think we referred to some stats, 68% under 6 months sentencing and less than 1% under 2 years, less than 1% over a 2-year sentencing.
Because I've read, that in many of these cases, people are caught with firearms. They're caught in possession of drugs. Is that the case that you're finding in some of these cases where you're catching people?
I mean, every case is different. I mean, obviously, when there's aggravating factors and additional charges, windfall evidence, firearms, other associated offenses, I would like to think that the sentences would reflect that, and I'm sure they do.
Are you seeing cases where people are getting 6 months or under 2 years when they're also caught with firearms or with drugs?
I don't have the data for that. I would imagine we're getting stronger sentences if there's firearms involved. I would certainly hope so.
Now, how much money does the average auto thief make per stolen vehicle?
It's hard to quantify it exactly, but there's multiple stages and layers in the auto theft process. There's spotters. They sometimes make $100, a couple $100, just to identify a vehicle in a driveway that'll later be stolen by a thief. That thief may make somewhere between several $100s to a couple $1,000s to steal it. Then there's runners.
One a night for the thief, or like are they doing multiples in every night usually?
Again, I don't really have the data to support that, but we'll see crews. These are auto theft crews working together, and they'll steal multiple vehicles in one night.
Okay, and you know, when we're seeing these sentences, do you think that the sentences, these 6-month sentences or these under 2-year sentences, that these are a deterrent for these criminals, or do you think that, you know, they feel that there's such a low likelihood that they're getting caught and the payday is so high, as you said, could be several $1,000s a night, that it's not really a huge risk for them? It's not really something they consider when they're stealing these vehicles.
Well, I'd like to think that there's a deterrent with the sentences, and there should be a deterrent. That should be one part of it. You know, it's also, you know, providing justice and, you know, the public you know, a sense of safety. So it's a combination of all those factors.
Now, with the you're aware of the Jordan principles in sentencing that came out from the Supreme Court in 2016. Do you think Crown prosecutors view, you know, these car thefts as just property crimes and less of a you know, place less importance on them than they do more violent crimes?
I wouldn't say that, and I think the establishment, again, and I can only speak for Ontario, of the major auto theft prosecution response team is going to, you know, counter a lot of those issues if that is the case. But we work very well with all of our MAG partners in putting cases before the court and prosecuting them.
Is that with so many violent cases, I mean, I think you'll agree, you know, there's some horrendous cases, sexual assault, sexual harassment of children, murders. There's people that are being let out because of the Jordan's principle, because their cases are taking too long. And I think, you know, Crown prosecutors are being put in a very difficult position where they have to choose between getting time for, you know, an assault case or a murder case or a sexual assault case, or booking time for vehicle cases. Do you think that they're having to make a compromise and, you know, give plea deals or give lesser sentences in order to speed up convictions on vehicle thefts in order to get these more violent cases brought up so that they don't get taken out by Jordan's principle? Is that something that you're seeing on the front lines?
I can't say that's something I'm seeing. What I can say is, you know, Jordan is something that we're working with. Our police officers are adapting and changing the way we investigate crimes, the way we conduct disclosure, and working with the Crowns in that manner. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. Now we're moving on to Mr. Gahir, please, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. To Mr. Wade, just initially, could you please provide the data about more crimes being committed by those on parole, whether it's on the rise or not? We would like to see the data. Otherwise, it's just anecdotal.
So, I mean, I can obtain specific data if that's what you're looking for. What I can speak to is the Provincial Carjacking Task Force. That's the data and the stats that I have. And out of 124 arrests, 55 of those subjects were out on bail when arrested.
I think in the grand scheme of this country, that's a pretty small sample size, no?
That's a small sample size, yes. It's just what I can refer to in the carjacking issue.
Thank you. Before I get into my questioning with Mr. McCrory, I did want to mention a point that Mr. Lloyd brought up. You know, study after study shows that the deterrence of the sentence on the likelihood of a crime being committed is actually pretty low. Study after study has shown that. I studied that throughout law school. When a criminal commits a crime, they're not really thinking about, oh, this is going to be a 3-year crime versus this is going to be a 5-year crime of what will I do more likely. What's actually more likely to sway their intention to commit that criminal activity is the likelihood of being caught. So if the rate that crimes are at which crimes are being solved is falling, that's going to actually spur more criminal activity because the criminal knows that they can get away with it. Mr. Wade, would you like to comment on that?
Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, wouldn't you agree that the likelihood of a crime being solved is more likely to deter criminal activity than the sentence?
Okay, sorry. It is a good question, and I believe that they're of equal importance. The ability to solve crimes and investigate crimes is equally as important as the ultimate sentencing and the court process.
Okay. Just the studies that I've looked at have shown that the former is more likely to have an impact on the psychology of a criminal or a potential criminal than the latter. The example that I wanted to bring up was we've seen the leader of the opposition constantly bring up this example of an individual that's had their car stolen, that has an AirTag that traces the car to a port, let's say the port of Montreal. They've informed local law enforcement, And according to this story, the local law enforcement will then indicate that, hey, we can't actually do anything now. It's the CBSA that takes over, and then this individual will watch their car sort of sail off into the sunset. Could you comment on that? Is that a very likely scenario? And what are the options if I'm the individual? I've had my car stolen. I used an AirTag to trace it to the port. What are my options?
So I think it is a plausible scenario, and we've seen press reports that refer to it, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is for somebody to experience that. And that's one of the reasons why, and I think it speaks to the collaboration that's taking place between law enforcement partners and the CBSA. We're developing what we call our request to locate protocol. And the very idea behind it is to provide Canadians guidance that if you do have a tracking device, an AirTag or something like that on your vehicle, what do you need to do to engage law enforcement to retrieve your vehicle? It'll always be focused first and foremost about engaging your police of local jurisdiction, but there will be an element in there for the CBSA to play a role when and if we can. And if I use, again, if I'm watching my car go from Toronto via the Toronto rail yards to Winnipeg, to Vancouver, there are many points of intervention along the way, and I think it speaks to the opportunities for police and CBSA to collaborate along that journey to stop the vehicle from leaving the country. And if it does get to a port, then we'll use our authorities and our tools to try to recover that vehicle. There are challenges. There won't be the only AirTag, for example, in a container in a port. And we're looking at how can we leverage technology to zero in on where that might be. But we're very concerned about that, and we are taking steps to address it, again, in collaboration with our policing partners.
So what does that collaboration look like currently? Example, like I've lost my car, I have an AirTag, I've traced it, I've informed local law enforcement, and it's going to be boarded onto a ship tomorrow morning. What's going to happen? What's the process?
Well, hopefully you're not engaging us by the time it's got to the port, because and what we'd ask people to do is to contact their local law enforcement, who can intervene more rapidly in the locale where it is. This is a hypothetical scenario. If it is then bound for a rail yard in the Toronto area and it's brought to our attention as in a container that we think is bound for export, we can use our authorities to go into the rail yard and open the container and retrieve the vehicle. Same if it gets to the port. There are logistical challenges. I don't want to overpromise in terms of what can be done and how it can be done. If you go to the Port of Montreal and you'll see stacks of hundreds and hundreds of containers, the ability to find the container with the AirTag in that stack is going to be daunting. And that's why we think the sooner we can intervene in that process, the better.